So hello everyone. Today is Tuesday, April 20th, 2021. My name is Pablo Ruiz, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to our Institute's Colloquium here at the Max-Planck-Institut for the History of Science in Berlin. As you know, this year's topic is Crisis and Capacity, Perspectives in the Humanities and the Social Sciences. And our purpose this year has consisted of bringing together scholars from different parts of the world and of inviting them to mobilize the resources of the history of science to enhance our understanding of the COVID-19 crisis, and conversely, to shed light on the manner in which the pandemic may be transforming the history of science as well. As we speak today, Germany debates modifying the Infection Protection Act to endow its federal government with augmented powers to fight the third wave of the pandemic. This has triggered debates on whether those modifications are compatible with the German fundamental law, on the efficacy of Germany's federal architecture to react to emergencies of this nature, and on whether the proposed modifications might infringe upon its citizens' personal freedoms. Beyond Germany, similar debates have erupted on what the pandemic has shown concerning what forms of governance are preferable. Today's session, Pandemic Polities, Science Governance in Democratic and Authoritarian Regimes, will be devoted to analyzing these and other similar questions, devoting particular attention to Chinese and Southern European contexts that have become highly relevant to address them. And to do that, we are honored to be joined by our two panelists, both of whom are good friends of our institute. Our first panelist is Annalisa Ahlers, the leader of the Lisa Meitner group on China in the Global System of Science that is based here at the institute. But before joining the institute, Anna was a tenured associate professor in modern Chinese society and politics at the University of Oslo in Norway. She has also worked at the University of Bonn, the Mercator Institute for China Studies, Academia Sinica, and the University of Chicago, where she was Vigilant visiting professor in the academic year 2018-2019. Anna is also a fellow at the Wissenschaftskollege zu Berlin. Our second panelist is Lino Campbrubí, this time an old friend of our institute that spent 3 years as a research scholar in Department 2 and a further year as a visiting fellow in Vittoria Tacic's Max-Planck Research Group on Epistemes of Modern Acoustics. Lino is currently a Ramón y Cajal Fellow at the University of Sevilla, where he has recently been awarded an ERC consolidated grant for his project Deep Med on the Mediterranean Sea. Lino is also the co-editor of the volume La Sociedad entre Pandemias, Society Among Pandemics, that came out only a few months ago. So before we go ahead and let our panelists get started, I wanted to add a quick note about format. So recall, first of all, that for this year's colloquium, we adopted a dialogical format in which different panelists engage with a single topic from different perspectives. On that spirit, and I will deliver a short 20-minute lecture first, followed by a similar lecture by Lino. This will be followed by further 20-minute discussion and more two panelists, and after that, we will open up the floor for questions. The Q&A session will be moderated by co-coordinator Stephanie Hood and myself. Remember also that we're recording the talks on the panel discussion portion of the session, but that we will not record the Q&A session. There will be a link also to the Etherpad where you can queue up your questions or write your own comments and reflections anonymously. And please note that you can find links to our Internet Library Corner in there, among other useful links. I also wanted to thank Verena Braun from the communications team and Aaron Richmond from the library for their help and support in organizing this session. And I think that with that, it is now Anna's turn to get things started.
Thank you, Pablo, for this generous introduction. Thanks to the organizers of this colloquium, and thanks to everyone in the audience for coming and to witness what I will try in the 20 minutes that I got, which is quite challenging. The organizers told me to do a micro lecture, but of course on this mega topic, which is not easy. We cannot yet afford the luxury to look back at history and access what has happened in this pandemic, we're still in the very middle of it. Also, the area of my specialization, China, I haven't been able to travel there for over a year. So what I can do here is give you some of my quite still, I think, preliminary and superficial observations and analysis. I will mainly do or work through two main provocations that I also think are connected to what Lino will share with us later. And to no surprise, I will say that what we experience now in the pandemic when we look at governance is blurring some of the very conventional ideas that we have about political regimes, how they govern crisis, and how they include scientific experiences and knowledge in their policy making. So that might be not too surprising. The 2 points in general that I want to do is when we look at pandemic governance as it unfolds right now or has unfolded over the course of the last year, are we actually really talking about political regime differences? So the differences of democracies and autocracies at all? That will be the first question. So it's about boundaries of political regimes. The second point will be about the ambivalence in the relationship between science and knowledge and policy making under pandemic circumstances. Or more concretely, you could say in this pandemic, how do governments, how do societies listen to the scientists? A claim that is, or a call that is often made. How do you listen to the scientists in this crisis? And again, how do democracies and how do autocracies do this or don't do this? That might be another point. And finally, so looking at these 2 points, what do we actually get from this, learn from this, can take with us to situations past this corona pandemic, to other global challenges in the 21st century. And I'll have some very brief comments here, and I'm sure that this will be explained much better by Lino also in the following talk. So this first point, the boundaries of democracies and autocracy and epidemic polity. I think we all just have to think about the situation we are experiencing right now beyond the medical emergencies and the personal anxieties and the daily care work toiling that we're all in this pandemic. There is this very prominent aspect of governance of the pandemic. It becomes very graspable at this moment. And I would say, especially in Germany at this very moment, where you can see a certain frustration with what is going on, the slow vaccine rollout, the asymmetries and targeting different groups with different measures on different sectors and all the related costs. And Pablo has also referred to that in his short introduction. Somehow you might even say there is a non-governance of the pandemic at the moment in Germany. I think that there might be some voices saying that because there's so many rules floating around. No one can really keep abreast of what is in effect and where, what are the details, what is the logical background to this. We have a federal system in which there's a very patchworky style of local adjustments of these measures, and that all adds to the confusion. And there's increasingly a comparison. So you look to different countries, you have these pictures coming in of places where people can already hang out again in bars or in shared offices. They have family celebrations and their graduation parties. And although this is truly a global pandemic, there is very obvious proof that there are very different situations in different countries. But where does this actually come from? So when we face this very same problem, a pandemic, where do the differences in the number of infections, the numbers of deaths and the handling of vaccine rollouts and everything comes from? Last year, in the beginning, when Europe was only considering pandemic measures, you had headlines like, in Nature, March 17th, what China's coronavirus response can teach the rest of the world. Obviously, it's a question whether the rest of the world has taken up these lessons, but I'll come back to that later. Still this winter, there was a headline in The Lancet, November 1st, China's successful control of COVID-19. So China is the go-to story. It was the go-to story in the early phase of the pandemic, paradoxically, you could say, because it's sometimes considered the origin of the virus itself. Different theories about where the virus is coming from. Some might also blame the Chinese political regime for the scope of the problem because of the initial neglect of the crisis and the conscious political cover-up. And now you see that it's also the place that is recovering fastest and most effectively. You might only think of the economic data that came out of China in recent days. So this is also the message that the Chinese political leadership is promoting. It hails its own approach to pandemic control and eventual success, while pointing to the chaos around the uncontrolled infection spreading and the late and insufficient distribution of protective equipment and vaccines in Europe and the US. Whether to follow the Chinese or the East Asian examples of corona control was a discussion in Europe and in North America. And there was, I would say, the general conclusion that was very clear that although it was in a way regarded as effective, the different measures that were taken, and there was a certain fascination with it, the Chinese model of coercive and technocratic pandemic management was not what governments and societies over here wanted to follow. That's a point I'll come back in a minute. So recently, however, the situation has become even more complex, and I'd say that this starts with the rollout of the vaccines around the globe. Now the differences in pandemic management are seen no longer just between East Asia and the rest of the world, or island states and the continents. There are also huge differences between, say, Europe and the US or Israel, for example. So by now, the explanations of the differences in pandemic governance have become more complex, and there are very different ones. Some are referring to the harshness of measures, others to the organization of expert advice and modeling, others to the more disciplined population, or less concerns about privacy, which makes contact tracing easier in different countries, or just a better vaccine purchasing strategy or purchasing power. So no longer is there general discussion about political regime differences or differences in local political tradition and culture. It's more about what I would call contextual governance. There's not this one trick, the one model to follow in order to handle the pandemic well or better than others. It's always much more complex. And in fact, it is actually stunning how, given the same basic challenge that I've outlined, there are so many different regional and societal responses at the meso and the micro level. And I think this, I would call it the same but different aspect of the pandemic, will keep social scientists and humanities scholars busy for many years and decades, I would say. So if it's not regimes in general, how can we then conceptualize differences in governing? And especially, I would say, the challenges for democracies. Pablo has also referred to that I'm still fascinated with. And I think what the organizers have pointed to, pandemic polities, is actually a very good term to do that, because it points to this contextual nature of political decision-making under conditions of crisis. And here, the boundaries between the regime become blurred, but they actually don't vanish completely. Recently, I have published a book with colleagues in Bonn where we thought about the differences of autocracy and democracy in the 21st century. And we came to say that although there are all these sophisticated models of military dictatorships and all sorts of different regimes where you can group countries to, you can actually also make a very simple distinction in policy making or political decision making. For democracies, decisions are based on values that are contingent to the political process. It's a process that counts. Actually, you can put all the questions to this process and decide on the outcome in a majoritarian, usually, process. For autocracies, there's usually something else, an external value, a party, a religion, a clan, some sort of political value that it cannot get around and that is not made subject of the political process. So it's a very simple definition. And I also think it helps us to understand what happens in a crisis mode now in different political regimes, where you see that the boundaries are blurred, but there's still a difference in decision making. So the crisis in the corona pandemic is a medical one. And I think all countries, if you look at them, have chosen to save individual human life. That's the main thing, the main value that you follow. And now democracies have to live with the challenge to narrow decision making for a while. I mean, we all expected that this would maybe take some months, then it was a year, now it's a bit longer, but it's considered to be temporal. So you have to narrow decision making to this one major goal. There's not a reduction of complexity. You still have to take care of all other questions as well, but there is a prioritization. And I think that's something that usually, under usual circumstances, democracies are not used to do. So that's where this challenge and the problem, the debates come come from at the moment. Not acting was not a decision. So even Sweden or other countries who first tried to somehow not make pandemic measures their first priority, they had to fall in line, and now they all have to follow this one major goal. But the challenge is that it's not actually coming out of the political process. It's an environmental challenge that these polities have to live with, and this is changing, at least temporarily, how politics is organized. So while further future studies have to deal with all the details of this story, I think what we can say that although this major bifurcation does maybe not make sense, you can actually identify a polity that forms around a certain crisis and that then follows a certain political logic. And the problem is that democracies are usually not used to prioritize one singular goal among all others, I would say. So once you have decided that this is the goal, you have to save life, this is first priority, how do you then organize things? What is the basis for your decision making? And here I come to the second topic that I wanted to talk about, the relationship of the pandemic polity, as I would call it. And again, I'm borrowing this from the organizers, so kudos to their choice of terminology, and science or knowledge. And does the pandemic actually tell us more about this, this relationship? Is it different under these circumstances? Interestingly, when you look at what happened early last year, when Europe, North America was realizing there was a pandemic unfolding, they had to do something. What is actually interesting is that there was not so much learning going on. So the decision makers did not go back to historic cases or even the synchronic cases in East Asia. I think what our institute's projects, History on Call and Masquerade, showed very beautifully is that there is so much knowledge, so much experience. You could call it science, you could call it contextual knowledge around, but in a way it's fascinating how little of this was taken up. And as I pointed out before, I think it is a kind of conscious consensus in European and North American societies to not do it. So what did they do instead? East Asia was, as I said, was experienced more. They had SARS in 2003. There was H1N1. So a lot of these measures people were already used to. But again, my colleagues, for instance, Mariana Rudiak, Maximilian Meyer, and others point to this othering. It's always the other's experience, and it has not been taken up by societies in Europe. I stressed that before. So what is then the logic? And I think still you could somehow read into how politics function here, that the goal was still to have some sort of science-infused democratic decision-making. But how is it supposed to work? We know about the problematic relationship between, say, expert advice and democratic decision-making, or technocracy and democracy, looking at the EU and debates about the non-democratic nature of the EU, or constitutional courts or other bodies to which you outsource decision-making to experts. So how is that then supposed to work under a crisis mode? Just to give you some snippets, I mean, we all know how this played out in different contexts. So in the US, under this credo of centralization, you suddenly have had a corona czar, later a vaccine czar or federal testing czar, quite archaic terms to call it. In Germany, a bit more mundanely, it was called the Corona Rapid Testing Task Force. I think it's not even existing anymore. But so there is a visual centralization of responsibilities and tasks, and often you put people from the CDC, so the disease control bureaucracies or others into place, or in Germany we have the Robert Koch Institute. So it is actually experts that you put into charge. When you now look at the case of China again, it does not look so much differently. You also have a Chinese CDC. I'll talk for some seconds about it in some minutes. But you also have this, what you would classically imagine, this staged expertise under party control. You have heroes that are sent out on missions to Wuhan, the assumed origin of the virus. They all carry the badge of the party. It's supposed to show that the political leadership in China is in full charge and abreast of what is happening. So does this confirm a difference in relationship between political regimes and science or expertise? Maybe not in the first place. There are some indications where you could say, okay, this is what we would usually expect. I'll only highlight a very few of these features. In the so-called democracies here in Europe, for instance, you can identify the centralization that I've just mentioned, and this is maybe to the relief of those who now fear that I'm going to say this is all turning into a big autocracy under pandemic circumstances. I think it's not, because what you see is that external scientific experts have never really taken over governing, of course. It was still happening along these usual structures that you have of outsourcing expertise and expert input into policy making. Although I would say it's still much more messy than what we usually see when you have drug administration or patent approval or something. This is working much more smoothly than what we see now. Advice flies all around. You have the Leopoldina, I made some other notes here, and other experts who come, these individual VIP epidemiologists, I would call them, who come in and you either trust him or them, and they have different suggestions on how to act, and you actually don't really know from a public point of view which input is taken up and how. It's still happening behind closed doors, so there is a lot of opaquity. And still, I would say the sluggishness in which this is enacted gives those who fear for the future of democracy a little relief. I think it is a temporal measure. It is a chaos, and it's an emergency mode of governance. So when we look at China in comparison, still, and I've outlined how you from the surface, how that looks like from the surface, but I think if you look at it in detail, and we try to do it, of course, partly in my new research group, in the first place, of course, the Chinese political leadership has this ideal legitimation of being a technocratic government. They have the most advanced knowledge and always follow the latest kind of knowledge that can be put into place for decision making. That's the narrative. But it's interesting that in this crisis, the party obviously also needed these external experts. We can discuss later how much external they are, but at least we have these press conferences with external experts that are advising the government, that carry the party's badge on a mission in a task force. And it's real scientific advisors. They are very renowned international scientists in very highly acclaimed positions in China and research organizations. It's not some kind of pseudo expertise or esoteric guru style advice that they are seeking. It is external scientific policymaking advice. And Catherine A. Mason, among others, have shown how this has emerged actually as an outcome of the SARS pandemic in 2003. There's very much science-based public health bureaucracy that is there to legitimize party rule domestically, but also towards the outside. So this is one quite interesting phenomenon. It is understudied, I would say, and it's something we need to come back to understand also the nature of technocracy, if you want, in China today. The second, and I know that I'm running out of time, so I'll soon come to an end. The second interesting fact is, or not fact, the second interesting observation is that you find somehow the same Faucis and Drostens in China that you find here. You have these public VIPs. Some of them are in official capacity, some of them are not, or not yet. You have these public corona experts. And although the discussion here is not so much about the democratic decision-making process and whether they are taking that away, of course, that's not the issue. It's very much about their professional background, how much you can trust their scientific expertise, and also about the personal characters, actually, their personal traits. Do they seem trustworthy? Is what they tell you about the pandemic something you should actually follow? And if you follow social media closely, and there is a subgroup in my research group who does it, and I was actually personally really surprised of how much public debate there is about what you expect as a disinterestedness of these experts. They should not be involved in any vaccine companies or hold stocks in drug companies or something else. They should be scientific experts. They should also not be too close to the party and only do lip service to them. And you see this when it's debated them what their messaging looks like domestically, but also vis-a-vis the international community. Or when they talk during a press conference, and then just opposed to how they what they say about the pandemic in social media. So it's a very, very interesting phenomenon in today's China. And I think, so again, this tells us that these regime boundaries, in my view, they're still interesting and important, but there's also these transgressive things that are very important to look at, such as the public understanding of science and science communication, public trust in science. How do you organize the advisory role of experts in politics under regular circumstances and in a crisis mode, and things like that, that you can that's very nice, it's very interesting to look at as a comparative research project. So last words, what do I think from this very superficial and very preliminary macro points that I listed, can we take home if we think about this ambivalent relationship of science and politics, or politics and science, and all of that in this pandemic, but beyond? I think there's a lot to say about our understanding of technocracy, maybe even scientocracy in 21st century in different societies around the world. I think it looks different from the 20th century, but it's something I think that Lino knows much more about, and I'm happy to discuss this with him later. Looking at these phenomena across regime boundaries, I think is a very interesting research endeavor, and also things that go beyond this pandemic into what I would say global societies are facing in the coming years and decades. And I don't want to sound like a doomsday herald and saying that I would agree with some of the people who have said that what we see now is maybe what we have to get used to, that will maybe become some sort of new normal when we are facing pressing problems in coming decades, such as climate change, of course, the big challenge, but also inequalities, mass migration, and things like that. And societies will increasingly, I think, have to make these choices now between, or what was conceptualized before, these choices between true and objective against correct or moral solutions. I think it's replaced by different cleavages here. So I think what I hope I have made clear is that I'm not arguing that either autocracy or democracy is more able to face these challenges, at least not in the current forms. The challenge is rather to find ways to agree on and then to organize the prioritization of some policy issues over others in an inclusive and sustainable way that are not based on the conventional cleavages of party or identity politics as we know them right now. And I think things like climate change is one of these challenges where we face this. And the organizers have said we should save some things for the discussion, and that's what I'm doing here. And I'm ending and giving the floor to Lino. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Anna. That was not only very sharp and insightful, but also surprisingly well-timed. So thank you for that. And with that, we can just go on and let Lino deliver his own lecture.
Yes, thanks a lot, Anna. I actually was going to ask you to keep talking because you left there a very interesting cliffhanger, but don't worry, people, I will be brief so that we can listen to what she has to say. Thanks a lot because you've done all the hard job for me already. Thanks also, of course, for Pablo for his very kind introduction, and for him and Lisa and Stephanie for organizing this wonderful colloquium series and for inviting me to it. It's for me a kind of bittersweet experience to be talking to you here. It's great to be back at the colloquium after 2 or 3 years, but it's also I mean, I can't see you, right? I need to scroll down to see to see the faces of those of you who have chosen to put the cameras on. So it's not really being back. But anyway, it's an honor and a pleasure to participate in this conversation. I have very little to offer you, I'm afraid. My only credentials for being here, apart from friendship, is to have edited a very, very thick book on the coronavirus crisis. I've done that, and this means that I've read at least 700 pages on the pandemics, but I'm sure that's about what we have all read. So I've read a little more than that, but these 700 are concentrated in a single piece, which I have been thinking about, right? How do these different pieces connect? And the interesting thing about this book that Pablo mentioned, it's called Sociedad entre Pandemias. Unfortunately, it is in Spanish. I mean, unfortunately for those of you who don't read Spanish, but the interesting thing about the book is that it has chapters by very, very different experts in fields from the sciences and the humanities. Many of them are by physicians, epidemiologists, but also historians, philosophers. Some of them you know. One of the authors, for instance, is Rainy Daston, who was director of one of the departments at the Max-Planck. I think this has allowed me to reflect a little bit on what does technocracy means, because what we have here is different experts from different disciplines saying very different things, right? And this is consistent with my own historical investigations on technocracy. I think that the main point that we as historians of science and technology, or as science scholars, or however you want to identify yourself as, is that there is not such a thing as technocracy, or at least there is not one single technocracy. There are many forms of technocracies. There are many kinds of experts. That's the point. So when we think, as people think a lot these days, on the relationship between scientific expertise and political action, what can we add to the conversations? We historians, sociologists, philosophers of science, we can add this plural form, right? To keep reminding the public that there are different experts, and there are also different publics. And the way experts relate to public opinion needs to be always contextualized. I don't know if this is what Anna was referring to as contextual governance, but it does prevent us from this tendency towards general statements regarding how to manage a polity and what's the place of science in it. First of all, because there are different sciences. This is what I'm getting at this first part of the intervention, right? And I think what has been most obvious, the clash between two different forms of expertise in the last year, has been that between public health experts and more particular epidemiologists, experts in models, for instance, of how disease spread, and economic experts. And these two things have been put by the public imaginations, but also often by scientists themselves, as being in contradiction to one another, right? You need to sacrifice the economy in order to preserve the lives of individuals or the lives of the population. The problem, of course, is that this clash is not as black and white, because we know that among the main public health indicators is, of course, wealth, right? If you have an impoverished population, you're going to have more deaths anyway. So this has been often presented as a contrast, when what is challenging is to understand how those two things connect. What is the actual way of thinking together with public health and economic issues? So that the coronavirus pandemic, it has been pointed out many times, is not the public health crisis, right? It's often called a syndemic. It's a pandemic that affects the whole political body. It has many ramifications. We shouldn't be listening only to one type of experts. That's the point. And I am very happy that I get to talk after Anna, because Anna has already set the landscape of the different, right? Not falling into judging that one country because it was a dictatorship, then it followed. There are many complex factors, and what we need to understand is with detail how have the countries which have been, let's say, more successful in fighting the pandemics actually done. They have not mobilized the dictatorship or their technocracy, or what they've done is set up very specific techniques, very specific displays, right, on the ground. So following the actual functioning, the practices of those techniques and also their materiality, I think helps to bring those big debates down to earth in a way which is productive. Is not just negating all roles for general discussion. It's just putting it into its concrete context where it belongs. So to be a little more now positive, to say something positive, let's say, the title of my talk today is What Makes a Crisis? This title responds in part to the general title of this year's colloquium, which includes the phrase COVID-19 crisis in the description, I think, but it's also inspired in the title of a recent book by sociologist Jeffrey Alexander, which the title of that book, I think it's What is a Social Crisis? What Makes a Social Crisis? And in this book, as in others, Alexander understands that cultural perceptions and narratives are relatively autonomous from the events to which they refer. What this means regarding COVID-19 is that it is useful to distinguish the damage caused by the virus itself from the scientific and popular dramatizations of its traumatic effects in the context of today's conversation. Keeping this in mind can be useful to understand divergent political responses to the same or similar scientific knowledge. This is what Anna was presenting as the main problem in the years to follow, basically, how the same challenge gets different responses. What I'm saying is the first way is to understand how this same challenge is actually perceived as completely different challenges by different groups of people. And this is not, so to give some examples, tuberculosis, TB, is an infectious disease, and it kills each year about 1.5 million people worldwide. And this is around half of what COVID-19 has killed in its first year, but it's still a lot. And yet I think that most of us hadn't heard about it in the last years. I mean, many of us hadn't, at least. Tobacco, right? Smoking kills around 7 million people per year worldwide, which is much more than COVID. And we have not stopped the economy because of that. On the contrary, countries and private companies make huge profits on selling tobacco, right? So this is not a negationist argument. I'm not saying COVID is a joke. I'm saying that, and I mean, adding a new disease to the many already existing ones is, of course, something that we need to be concerned about, and it's a new disease, and I understand all that. What I'm saying is that we, as historians of science, and maybe as historians in general, as you know, people in the humanities, that's one of the things that we should be trying to understand, right? Why sometimes the same events or the same numbers of deaths, to put it that way, are interpreted in apocalyptic terms that require immediate political action, and why in some other cases they are not. I think this is a huge problem that we need to address, and it's the problem of public imagination of things related to science, to put it that way. Sharp contrast, and I mentioned before the chapter by Lorraine Dust in the book that I co-edited recently. The sharp contrast in reactions to climate change, for instance, and COVID-19 is also very interesting. If we take seriously what the International Panel for Climate Change is telling us, for instance, we should be panicking, we should be closing down the global economy, we should be doing all those things. We are not, and it needs to be said, well, it's impossible to do them. COVID-19 has proved that it is possible to do it, at least for a couple of months. And it's of course much harder to do it forever, right? But it has been proven that with the enough imagination of fear, let's say, people are actually willing to do such kinds of things, right? And people are taking the lesson, well, then we should learn that and how to do it and do it for climate change. But even that, the problem is prior. The problem is that why are people willing to perceive some events as apocalyptic and others not, of the big questions? And it's even, as I'm saying, it's even prior to those distinctions between democracy and autocracy and things like that, right? It has to do with other factors. One of the big factors, as Anna also mentioned, is SARS 2003. There is a big correlation between the countries who already experienced that epidemics, which was a coronavirus epidemic. It killed far less people than COVID-19, but it was enough to create several political response in many countries of Southeast Asia, but not only. Also Canada, for instance, they was in the face of disaster and in the aftermath of it, they produced protocols. First of all, this experience created a public opinion which was already knowledgeable of that kind of fear and of how to counter it, the sacrifices that were needed to counter it. But it also, at the top-down level, created the institutions that were able to respond to that kind of emergency. And this is true across countries, politically as different as Taiwan and China, or as Japan and Taiwan, Japan and China, New Zealand, Australia, and again, even Canada. Those different countries have protocols that is not that they are technocratic protocols. They are technocratic in the sense that they are not subject to partisan politics because they have become institutionalized in the way the country functions, basically. So they don't need to be subject to the discussion of whether this is a pandemic that we should be worrying about. This, as Anna said, happened in China in the first maybe couple of months, in which the danger was being downplayed, but the moment it is confirmed this is spreading, then there is a bunch of things that happen, right? And the thing in Taiwan is amazing. Taiwan, which is a democratic country, so again, it's not about that. It has only 11 reported deaths attributed to coronavirus, 11. And it's one of the countries that receives more Chinese visitors, obviously. Japan is also one of the countries that receive most Chinese visitors. It's funny how many reports on Japan insist of presenting it almost as a failure because it has more deaths than South Korea or Singapore, but in comparison to Europe or the US, it's a complete success. And it has never introduced forced lockdown measures. And this is also what is interesting, right? There are, as Anna was saying, different ways of getting to the same result. Most of these ways, however, most experts agree, have to do with early screening and testing, and also tracing. And then you can perform specific lockdowns with the people that you're targeting, that you know that carry the virus or are potentially contagious. This is very different from the general lockdown policy that most Western countries have followed. But the interesting thing is to be able to react on time before there are too many cases, so that you can really count and trace specific individual cases and isolate them. Why has Europe been completely not only Southern Europe, because I'm here on behalf of Southern Europe, and that's what I'm supposed to talk about, but actually it's exactly the same in the whole of Europe and also in the US. I think it's a matter of imagination. If this had been perceived as not as an apocalyptic danger, but as a danger big enough that it needs to be addressed, then that policy would have created much less damage and it would have been possible to implement. Most countries, what they did was nothing until it was too late. And then they did it all. Then they went for total lockdown. And this creates an economic crisis on top of the health crisis, which is a terrible outcome that we are experiencing. It's easy for me, to say what should have been done and so on, but that's the main comparison that people are making between what is happening in many countries in Asia and what is happening in many countries in the North Atlantic. Is a matter of prevention, and prevention has to do with imagining a fear, right? That's what I'm insisting. If it's a thesis to what I'm saying, has to do with that the number of deaths alone is not enough to trigger imaginations, and that in order to understand political reactions to crisis, we need first to understand how is a crisis made at the level of perceptions. I think that has been clear enough. I think I have a few more minutes. I didn't count them actually. How long did I talk for?
I think you can take a few more minutes.
Okay. So
no more.
Sorry?
I said up to 5, but no more.
Okay, good. Yeah, just to give some flesh to what I'm saying about the failure to act in Europe or in North America, you're all familiar to those cases. Anna was talking about non-governance. The place where I come from, in Spain, they didn't do anything, but anything means zero, until about mid-March, when we suddenly, very quickly, in 2 weeks, escalated to total lockdown. That's bad enough, right? That's bad enough, and it was made the news. It's exactly the same in Italy, or more or less the same in Italy, although some regions in Italy were very much faster in responding, sorry. But what is for me really, really interesting is not that first hit, when you can still say it's a lack of experience. What is for me very interesting is the second and third waves, right? In Germany, for instance, the first wave was more or less controlled, but there was a second, then the third one was pretty terrible. And this has happened in countries across the North Atlantic region. And that's for me, because there were 3 or 4 months in which could have been done, right? Like putting in place tracing mechanisms. So when you start opening up and having new cases, you can really follow them. And everybody was saying that they were going to do that. They were investing in doing that, but didn't happen. Some people perhaps correctly to a kind of individualistic lifestyle in the North Atlantic, and want to be traced. We want governments to know where we are going and things like that. The counter example, of course, is New Zealand and Australia, where there was individual tracing, and the culture is very similar to Western cultures, right? Whatever that might be. So I don't think that's particularly a reason. Again, the real difference between these countries is they had protocols that really taught you what to do with specific cases before the pandemic was to spread out. And this again has to do with the prior experience of SARS 2003. So in order to conclude my first 20 minutes, again, this is a call for us to think about public imaginations of how to call this, of scientific entities, or of public crises that have to do with scientific knowledge. Scientific knowledge is not enough if it's not accompanied by the imagination of its results, and imagination is a first condition to political action. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks to you, Lino. Thanks a lot. I think we can actually directly move on to the panel discussion segment of the session, and I'll have you and Anna engage with each other's points of view.
So my spontaneous reaction to Lino, and in conversation with what I tried to lay out, well, the first point is maybe something I will not try to start discussing here, as I tried to also avoid it myself. This one explanation for why governance is so different. I think it's so complex, and we just need so much more information and data in the end, retrospectively, to analyze what has been going on. I have some assumptions that and I'm sure this question will come up again in the Q&A, that I can share there. But one thing I actually find even more fascinating while listening to Lino is, again, this question of how much science are we actually talking about here? So my first question was, what about regime boundaries? But also listening to both of us, I would say one could actually critically ask how much science is actually involved here. Because if I try to conceptualize what was going on in these governance patterns that we have both talked about, I think science has worked pretty well. I mean, scientists were from the very first minute engaged in identifying the virus, sequencing its genetic information, sharing this information worldwide. But that's happening in the scientific domain. Then you had these, what you called, I think you called it the different local imaginations of science, or the experiences also made 15 years ago, more than 15 years ago, under the SARS crisis, protocols that were enacted locally. You were saying, Lino, I think your argument is that this is only enacted in some countries, but not in others. But that, to me, is more of an immediate ad hoc political reaction. It's not necessarily science as well. So you have science as science, you have some immediate political measures that were taken, but in this level between them, how much science is actually infused into these immediate decision-making procedures, I don't see this yet. And I would challenge us again, and maybe the audience, to talk more about that, because you could also say, and that was what I was referring to, partly by non-governance, but also by that it's so difficult to follow how much these experts that we are seeing every night in our talk shows and everywhere are actually having an influence on decision making. Because looking at Germany, provocatively, you could say what's going on now is just makeshift measures. Everyone's waiting for the effect that will be brought about by the vaccine. That's what the scientists have provided. But this meso level, where you all the time have very specific scientific, okay, close the schools, it's aerosols, no, it's I don't know, liquid transmission or something. That is still so, I mean, I'm not an expert as well, so I also have a hard time judging what is going on, but that's so diffuse. And maybe that's also, there's a lot of scientific information sharing, but not so much sharing about how exactly these information have to materialize in political decisions. I know this sounds very abstract, but that's one of the observations I made while I listened to you talk. And I'll stop again.
Yes, no, that's a very good point. And I would say that also we need to distinguish how much science from how much knowledge in general, in that, let's say we are calling biomedicine science, and then non-pharmaceutical interventions, for instance, they are even less known than the other ones. To put an example, how many studies are there of the real effects of a 3-month lockdown, for instance? Probably none. And so the knowledge of how the virus spreads was pretty firm already in February and March 2020. The knowledge of how to counter that's another matter. And that was many times based in intuitions, even intuitions by scientific experts, right? But I mean, well, it's not an intuition. If you stay at home, the virus is not going to spread. But what are the other outcomes of that general lockdown? How do we measure the negative effects of a general lockdown in psychiatric terms, in economic terms that then reverse in public health again? How do we measure those against the benefits, right? That kind of a study has not been done. They are being done now, obviously. They have been done in the last year, but politicians were acting in the dark there. That's why I know pointing to one single factor would be naive at this point, but having protocols that are related to a prior similar pandemics, I think that was key. Another aspect that was perhaps very important, and it's related to our previous conversation on technocracy and so on, is how, again, these protocols that were already existing were not subject to party politics. The rest of it was, at least in the North Atlantic. And again, to go back to the example of my own country, it's a mystery for me, but a very interesting at that the virus was basically downplayed by the political left until mid-March. And it was depicted or coded as a catastrophe by the right, by the political right. And then 2 months after, it was completely opposite. It was the left who was saying, well, this is apocalyptical, and the right was saying, oh, come on, this is not so big. How does that happen? I think it has to do with structures, binary structures of polarization. It is not only party politics, it's basically human societies work a little bit that way. You need to attribute, at least according to some of the things that Jeffrey Alexander says in the chapter to the book I edited, that these are structures of how people think, but there are some things that can be preserved away from that polarization. And those protocols were based on SARS 2003 were some of these things in which there is a relative consensus among the civil society. My question to you would be, since there are no party politics in China, do you still find those kinds of polarizations, or is there even a way to find them, to look for them, right? Those kinds of polarizations around a topic like COVID-19?
Yeah, very interesting point. And as I pointed to, we are in the middle of trying to, from our desks in Berlin, assess what is going on. Of course, you can always look at social media or media in general to assess public sentiments, debates, although, of course, we all know to somehow limited degree under circumstances in the PRC. But still, there's, as I also said, surprisingly much to find in terms of especially looking at the experts that are put in public roles for handling the crisis or for serving as advisors to the government. I think that's very, very interesting. Of course, the debates are a bit different than, as you said, they would be in a party system or a parliamentary system. That is even more important. But this public trust in science and public communication of science in this pandemic is something that is super fascinating, and we are only at the very tip of analyzing all the different voices that you can find in this debate. So I'm not sure I can yet say that it's polarization. It's just also a very strong diversity of views on what is the best way to protect yourself. I think this governmental strategy of shutting down completely was, in hindsight, although it raised a lot of protest and disgruntlement in the beginning, is now in hindsight evaluated as a very, very good measure, and everyone's happy that the government has taken such drastic measures because people are enjoying restaurant meals and are more or less leading their normal lives again, given all the costs of this crisis. But I think in hindsight, the public evaluation of the governmental measures is rather positive. Again, I'm saying this with a grain of salt because that's only what we can see here. What I find, as I said, even more interesting is this turn to some very visible public experts, and also the debate about whom to trust. It's almost like this debate about, is it Henrik Streeck or Christian Drosten or even Mr. Kekulé, whom we would trust more, who has more publications, who has says which, what, where, and in what context. So this is very fascinating to me. Honestly, I did not really expect it to be happening on such a scale. So within China, I wouldn't call it a polarization. I think it's very interesting. You can do very interesting studies about public communication of science, communication of the crisis, and also, of course, going beyond domestic politics and how the public in China is evaluating the measures taken in China vis-a-vis measures taken abroad. And as you can easily imagine, you have said that, and I've pointed to it. It's basically following this black and white line, I would say, saying that look at what is happening in Europe and the US. It's a huge chaos, at least when we look at pandemic governance. So that's what I would take away from the public debates, at least to the degree that they're accessible from here.
So once again, Anna timed it just right. I would like to thank everyone for joining us today and remind, well, thank the speakers first of all, obviously, and thank our audience for joining us. I wanted to remind everyone before we conclude that we wanted to reconvene on May the 18th and that my colleague Lisa Onaga will be back then to chairing our next session of the Institute's Colloquium. So that will be called Pulse Check Public Communication and Trust in Science. And so it will feature panelists Laura Spinney, Shifan Yang, and Scott Knowles. And now, having said that, I would like to once again take the opportunity to thank both panelists for their very interesting and appealing talks, and also for the discussion that ensued afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.